Record. Okay, I wanted to make sure we had the recorder on, and I do. So
Okay.
go ahead, Benji.
SAMC talks a lot about mass, and we work a lot on mass. That term itself doesn't sit well with me. It has its internal biases, right? Inherent biases. One is it comes from software as a service. For anyone else who doesn't own a car, mobility is a service. Very often it's very bad service, right? And so when we frame it as mobility as service and it's technology-led, it has inherent biases in that framing. Nevertheless, there's no other better term to use, so we can use that. The other thing that I think is problematic with this definition from Mobility Alliance is a single mobility service accessible on demand. Accessible on demand is great. Single mobility service promises this one ring to bring them all, which is basically not actually the way we run any of our technology services. The ones that it's one ring to bring them all, like your one social media or your one use of services becomes hegemonic in that way. So I would put quotation marks on single mobility service. It's the accessibility of the service and the ability to access that service to various means so that it is seamless to the user. The other thing with this is that it's not very, very much user-centric. It's about the service and then what does the agencies or the operators have to do. That's just my reaction to this. And so I think there's a room for SCAG to develop its own sense of what does it mean to have mobility as a service. If you ask me and you force me, I would say mobility as a utility is a better frame. And utilities means they need to be always available when you need them. Otherwise, it's not, you can't have light only for 1 hour a day or gas for only 1 hour a day, or you only get this much because you only have one appliance. So that's a lot to say, but you wanted reactions on that definition.
Yes, and thank you. So I'd like to invite Jessica and Marvin to provide their perspective and comment on what you had to say. Jessica?
Let's see if Marvin was going to go first.
Marvin, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Well, would you comment on the definition as Philip was sharing it, but also comment perhaps on Benji's observation that mobility as a service is misnaming it, and that looking at it more as a utility might provide a better perspective.
I hadn't thought of it as utility, but I mean, I think the definition there is good. The only thing I'd add, I know I mentioned it on Wednesday about freight. I think freight actually is going to jump on this too. But I don't know if, obviously that's not necessarily the same interest as we have here, which is focused on, whether people would be able to get their mobility needs. But I think actually it will take off in freight sooner and faster. But from the perspective as a utility, I think utility part would probably be just, the stuff that enables it. So the apps and stuff that make it work. But obviously maybe not the bikes themselves, but that is interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that.
All right. Jessica, do you have any observations you'd like to make?
Yeah. It's a lot of words. I don't know. It feels very theoretical and far removed from my own experience and the experience I hear from other community members and priorities around the ability to get around in the LA region. When I look at the case studies, my first question was, what's the mode split on those cities? And people who are not driving in the Los Angeles region are a really small slice in reality. and it's lots of people making lots of trips on transit. And I just struggle with this sophisticated look at mobility when we don't even have curb cuts, bus shelters, usable bus service that middle-class people who have a car would, so I just can't, I struggle to make the leap. I also kind of get bummed out when I see the case studies as being such radically different demographics than the region of Los Angeles. We are such a poor, huge city with Spanish speakers in the region even more. So I don't know,
Yeah, on the case studies, we were looking at places that have implemented MOS systems, and unfortunately, it is going to be those types of places, right? So if you know of a place that we should be looking at outside of what we presented, that would be helpful too.
Just to react to that, Philip, I'm sorry, Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, Philip, but I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse. If our region isn't a region that uses, somebody told me to, Salita's comments were, oh, there's a population in LA who already is using MOS, right? Able-bodied, wait.
I think what Salita's point was really, if we're talking about MOS as this technology platform, people that would benefit from that already have access to those options. She was concerned about the people that are excluded from all of those options right now, and how we can use MOS to deliver mobility to the people that need it, right? So she was sort of flipping that on its end. And I think that's sort of where you're coming from as well, right? MOS is not a solution itself. MOS is a means to address these issues of equity and access that you want to bring to communities that don't have it right now.
Yeah.
Does that?
I mean, I don't know. So I'll be quick, and then Benji, I'll hand back to you. To me, I'd really love a focus more on intermodal planning and options first before we talk about how to facilitate all these menu of options. Also, the silence on public service transportation versus private sector, those are mashing up some deeply problematic issues. And it's silent on all right, are we talking about privatizing everything? Are we not talking about privatizing? And so I think there's I'm probably one of the biggest skeptics on this advisory thing, that when they answered, is this the wave of the future, whatever those first points, I was like, no opinion, because it was also a binary question, which I wasn't really that into. It's with so many basic infrastructure issues in Los Angeles region, and sorry, Marvin, I don't know enough about the IE, but if we're talking about increasing mobility for the population that has the least amount of options, the most dangerous conditions, and the most unreliable, slowest ones, I'm not sure this rises to the top. So I'm a skeptic, but Benji, what do you think? I'll kick it back to you.
I'm with you. It is technologically triumphalist, right, in so many ways. But here's my suggestion, right? What if you take this definition and rewrote it so it's not about the technology, it's about the user, right? So what does mobility as a service mean for your user who needs to get around? What does that look like, right? Because what this does, and comes from the Mass Alliance, because what they're trying to do is create a market for mass, right? But what does it mean for the people who need to use mobility, who are dependent on mobility services? Define that, and that's where your first step is on. You frame this breakout as public education, and to me, that's also paternalistic. Like, you need to educate the public. It's really public engagement, right? So you start from where people are and who uses this, or uses all the services, including public transportation, and what are you promising with mobility as a service? What does it mean for them, and what does it look like? So the technology itself follows if you put the user first.
Right. And I would just mention that we heard a lot that would support what you just said, Benji, through the interviews, that meeting community needs has to happen first, and then the rest will follow. So I think we can move on, if you're all right with that, to the next topic, which was taking a look at the infrastructure needs. So if you could, or the existing conditions, could you pull up that slide, please? Okay. So these were the preliminary conclusions that David reviewed. And it gets into each of the key framework elements. So the first one, in terms of infrastructure, that there's a solid foundation to start building a MOS system. Would you, and
We
then,
we had comments in the chat on this, right?
yes,
So
we did.
Unbelievably
please go ahead.
general.
We had a lot of comments on that, and we can actually perhaps focus in down below first, which is public education and outreach. As a relatively new concept for a large number of SCAG communities, more outreach programs are needed to educate the public and help improve public acceptance. And I think what I was hearing from you earlier and through the interviews is that if you're addressing community needs first, then trying to educate people on the technology will flow out of that. But let's have you provide your feedback on that.
Oh, sorry, Jessica, I'll let you go. I talk too much.
No, go for it, Benji.
Well, you're the frame, right? Public education and acceptance. Can you hear that tone? Right? It's like, we need to educate you and you need to accept this, right? And the reason you're not using it is you're not educated about it. And if you reframe that and say, how are the this is an existing conditions, right? And we don't even talk about existing conditions of how accessible is transportation now? What's the mode split, as Jessica says? How much do you invest in public transportation versus all the other services? And what is that impact on communities and access to opportunity, access to health, access to public amenities and public services, right? So if we're going to talk about existing conditions, you start about existing conditions for the current users of transportation apart from private cars. And then you go from there. And if you meet their needs, then we don't need to educate you. We're actually meeting your needs, right? And you will take it up in just a matter of availability, right? Awareness rather than education and acceptance. So I would strongly, and this is why I asked DeRosa at the very start, when you write this, your white paper, you have to have very strongly what your advisory group is saying. And one of the strong things I'm going to point out is there's a lot of biases built in the way you frame this. And going back to the top line, right? Infrastructure has solid, which infrastructure? Infrastructure is such a mass noun. Are you talking about concrete infrastructure? Are you talking about the financial infrastructure? Are you talking about the information infrastructure and the data sharing infrastructure? Which one is that, right? And you can't just generalize and gloss it over. And then the other thing that this preliminary conclusions is woefully inadequate on, and I hope you will have it in the white paper, is let's talk about the history of transportation investments and transportation policy and transportation infrastructure and the harms they've created and the benefits they've brought in too. And how does MAS address that? Because if it doesn't, then you're just empowering people who are already empowered.
All right, excellent points. And I know Jessica and Marvin, you undoubtedly have perspectives as well. So
Sure.
Marvin, why don't, or Jessica, you're on the screen. Why don't you start first?
Yeah, I think that all sounds right on what Benji's lifting up, cosign all that. Yeah, infrastructure is so many different things. Actually, my brain goes with it. I've been so intrigued by the infrastructure of care conversations that have been happening, and I've been doing a lot of work with women in transportation, particularly mothers. So yeah, lots of questions about which infrastructure are we talking about, with half the sidewalks broken in the city of Los Angeles, you know. So, and then I'm just really curious to, again, like, can we be very clear about who we're really intending to improve the technology and the options for? During the worst days of COVID, we saw certain bus lines actually increase ridership while certain decreased, yet Metro won't share that information. We can't even have transparency on the neighborhoods on where that was happening, right? And so, like, I'm curious about the people who didn't leave our buses. Lots of people left our trains. but our buses stayed at 65 to 70%, and in some places 70% during the worst days of the pandemic. Is that maybe our target group of like who could really use some support and some options? Because clearly they had no other choice to get around during COVID, and they are essential workers, or they're caring for someone else or something like that. You know, so like that's those little slices of like, who are we actually trying to reach with this stuff? I already got my tap card on my iPhone. I'm all good. Like I'm really comfortable with this stuff, but it's my mother-in-law. I mentioned that on the call the other day. So, and again, I get really confused when we say governance and institution, like who we talking about is managing this? Is this Lyft and Prop 22 stuff? Or is this Metro and our public tax dollars and all of that? And really, I'm intrigued by the movement that I'm hearing more and more people, even our mayor, Eric Garcetti, say is like, what did he say? Like mobility as a public service, right? So how does that mash up with this that seems pretty influenced by the private sector and innovations happening there? But those are some just initial thoughts.
Yeah, no, so I mean that who are we talking about? That's what we want to hear from. Who should we be talking about? And I don't know if it came across. Our intention with this was to center Moss on public transportation, but this question of, you know, what role does the public sector play? What role do transit operators play? What role do the private? That's all something we need to talk about and decide. I think make some decisions as a region, maybe not in the study, but establish like what are the key questions that we haven't resolved that need to be addressed, and we want to take those questions and have those policy discussions. So I don't have answers to your questions. I just want to hear more questions and more ideas from everyone.
Philip, I have lots of questions. No, that's cool. I mean, I think like if we are targeting current, and I only really know LA County, if we're targeting the people who use our buses in LA, then that shrinks our demographic incredibly to people under 25K, 30% English as a second language, have smartphones, but don't really necessarily want to do fluctuating costs. Like, you know, so that's that. If we articulate, that's who we're targeting, and not bros who live in Mar Vista. Like that's very exciting, I think, potentially.
Yeah. Hey, Marvin may have something to say, but just two more notes, right? One, it's this is a fault we have in government all the time, and I worked in government. We say public like it's a singular thing. It's publics. There are various interests, and what we do is we mash them up together. And the loudest voices always get heard. And we say we heard from the public, right? So we have to go say, who are your publics, right? And that includes what Jessica is talking about. And the other is missing from this preliminary conclusions is financing and funding, and who's going to pay for this, and how are you paying for it? So I think that should be included. And Philip, we don't need answers. I'm not asking answers from you. I'm partly preachy. I'm partly like trying to. Our job is to advise, right, and shape this paper the best we can. So we bring an agenda to it in many ways.
And you know, we knew that when we asked you to join, right? There's a reason we asked you to participate and appreciate your thoughts, because otherwise, your perspective is not going to come from the others on the group. Right. There is a finance part. It wasn't on the slide, but finance is one of the elements of our policy framework as well. We heard a lot about universal basic mobility and just the need for, like, going back to like the basics, the fundamentals, the need for more funding for transit operations. Like agencies are struggling to just provide service now. And so I think it can be hard to talk about this technology and all this other sort of bells and whistles when they can't even, you know, day to day manage to provide the service that they know is needed.
Well, I would throw in there as a bullet point revenue streams, right? Because it's different to say there should be grants, which is like we're looking for other, other governments to provide us, like federal government. And universal basic mobility, I don't know why that's under finance. That should be kind of an outcome goal. But revenue streams and resources need to be part of the conversation. Because if we expect VC to pay for this, right, venture cap, we're not going to get there. We need more public resources in public transportation and shared mobility.
All right.
Can I add one more thing to that finance discussion, though? I mean, can we unpack power? Like, because Philip, I would slightly disagree. Like, Metro has $8 billion budget, and we can't and they're choosing to spend that not on operations. And all the chisme chitty chatter about the federal stuff is we're hearing agencies are actually saying we don't want operations dollars because we can't sustain it once we put the service. So it's like there's also
right.
cultural and power issues about where we're currently spending our money that like
Right.
never gets talked about. And like, you know, I kind of wonder what the other groups are saying that are more agency folks like. So because I actually don't buy the fact that our sidewalks and our bus shoulders are so crummy because we don't have money. It's the power and the decision making that intrigues me a lot.
So Jessica, in terms of the focus being on meeting community needs, you can see with Metro where they are trying to do pilot projects on micro mobility. Do you see that leading in the right direction or not?
I don't know, but if it's 2021 and Metro's just saying that, gee, maybe they ought to provide funding for bus stops. That's just where my brain, pilots are really hard in the scale of the region to wrap my head around. And I think those micro transit things, I don't know enough about them to make a real educated guess, but my gut still goes to how come we're not even talking about how people access transit and the agency's not even funding that.
Right, and you did mention so many bus stops that don't even have shelters, right, as being an issue of getting more ridership. All right, with that, perhaps, oh, Marvin, you haven't commented yet on this. Could we go back to the other slide on the existing conditions?
Yeah, my comments are kind of in the line of what Jessica and Ben have already said, and I know we talked kind of about this on what there was that Tuesday, and
Yes.
and I know I made some of the same comments about like the lack of infrastructure and basic infrastructure that, you know, it kind of comes before some of this some of the MOS stuff even, you know, and just generally that. From what I see it in a lot of cases, between the fact that the priorities are misaligned, and a lot of stuff that people are trying to suggest MOS is the solution for. In some cases, it's just, you know, we could create, for example, MOS to help people get down the street to the corner to get to the store or whatever. But we could also just build the sidewalk that is not there, and or fix the buckled up sidewalk that's not there, and they could you know, be pretty mobile on their own. And so it's kind of the same issues that the others have mentioned. And so
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So let's move on to the recommendations on the policy framework. Should we go to the policy framework?
I mean, we sort of touched on this already with a lot of the comments on the public education acceptance, how we're even labeling that as, you know, we need to revisit that. But is there, in terms of just key policy areas, is there anything else?
I've got a couple, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, right. So one is just related to any policy framework you write. And I said it already, right? What's the history? You have to recount that history, because we're not starting from a balanced, equal frame. Everyone's happy, everyone's good. So I would put it first in the history, right? And why we got to where we did. Second is what's missing, and it might be under institution, but I would call it out separately, is capacity, right? So very much there is not enough capacity within governments and government agencies to manage information, which is the key thing you need to do for MAS, is you need to learn to manage information as an asset, not as a tool. And what do I mean by that? A tool is that you need a wrench next to you, and that guy needs a wrench, so you get a wrench too, and pretty soon you've got 6 wrenches and it's all useful for you, but there's no true wrench, and you can't run information that way. And even in more sophisticated big city agencies like Seattle DOT, we didn't have good information policy or good information management. And that will include things like, how do you know you're reinvesting in the information? How do you know the cost of those assets? So I would put capacity in information management under here, not just management and operations, which seems to assume it's just a personnel or org structure thing. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
So are you referring to basically like some sort of workforce development or developing skills amongst government staff?
Absolutely, absolutely. So for SCAG, how many people on SCAGs, if you have your workforce, how many can write Python and R?
We actually have a ton of new junior planners that are really good at that. But yeah, no, we had a while back a lot of efforts on addressing the need for technical capacity amongst all of our local jurisdictions on data analytics. So we're totally on board with that.
Right, but you've got a lot of ArcGIS users. I'm going to bet, right? But all of the technology mobility operators are not running their programs on ArcGIS.
Sure.
And so there's this technology, this data exchange that you have to translate it. And so building up the capacities of government in a very different skill set, right, and expertise set and frame, I think is going to be critical for mass.
Thanks.
And I don't even know what Python stuff is. I was like, what? One thing I'm just curious if would fit in this, even though, is like, so my brain goes to like, I always wish we had chapters of barriers to implementation or what's stopping us from doing this. But I'm wondering if that's more, it could be interesting in a section of the policy framework of how, and maybe this is also riffing off Benji's stuff on history, but how this interacts with our other policy choices. So say you could live close to where you work, or say your kid could go to your local school, or you had the kind of grocery store you wanted. Like, and Marvin was lifting this up, that eliminates some of the, it eliminates some of the need for some of the stuff, but like, I don't know if that's mashed up, because like, what if we gave everybody an e-bike? Like, so I think there's like other alternatives, issues, factors, opportunities that enhance or detract the success of this.
So we do have a challenges and opportunities task that we will get to at the next meeting. So it sounds like what you're saying about barriers to implementation and then interaction with other policy choices is part of that discussion.
Cool.
And we'll be sure to talk to the consultant team about that. I had I forget who it was. It might have been Steve Finnegan who said that he was surprised that we're still talking about MOS, that why haven't we already done it? And we didn't have a chance to follow that thought. But I think that asking that question, what's stopping us from doing this now, gets at all of those barriers and the fundamental reasons why we haven't done it yet.
Yeah. I would. Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
I'm not. Who's using Lyft these days? It's so hard to get it, and it's so expensive, and is, as my conservative brother would say, like the market correcting itself. Like, I don't know. And then with that recent appeal, like what I feel like that sector and scooters, as fast as they were, so I used, when my bus didn't show up, I called a Lyft. It was great. But as fast as that field kind of boomed, is it also just cratering as well? And are we living with COVID for a while? And like the things we thought were really awesome in 2018, everyone threw the scooters in the bay. Like, it's a pretty different world, it feels like. I don't know.
Yeah. This is a suggestion, but knowing who SCAG is and its role being a government entity, and even where AECOM is, there are things that are not included here, but would be really, really useful to succeed, to know, right, in terms of preliminary conditions, of which, Philip, you're touching on, right? What's the political framework, right? Who's got support and all of that? What is land use, right? What is the land use situation? What is the cultural situation, right? Jessica talked about mode split, who's using what already, right? And having those to have a complete picture of where it's coming from would be very, very helpful. Some of that is fraught, right? Because if you start talking about political considerations in a government paper, then that's problematic. So
See,
I don't know how you're
that's
gonna
the
handle
big
that.
elephant in the room, and I
Yeah.
wish somebody would come out and just say it to us so that we can write down this was brought up by the. I mean,
Well-
that is one of the big challenges. Like, how do we work together?
Yeah, one of that is that you can frame it under cultural considerations, including organizational culture.
Mhm.
Right. So part of it in terms of cultural, political, right, is that, it's a car culture thing, and everyone and all the messages are about freedom. And so you can start talking about that and what's the counteraction of that. And then organizational culture, which is like innovation is frowned upon, or innovation is seen as the practice of 3 people with a tiny budget, right? And the rest is all maintaining whatever we're already running. So there is a way to get to that. You might just want to be able to asterisk it as you work through it, saying we really need to cover it, because if it's a blind spot for us as we're trying to execute on this, or at least write a plan.
So would you think it might come through as they work on the implementation guidance in the toolkit? Because there's such a range of conditions that we're dealing with across the region. Ventura is very different than LA, is very different than Riverside and San Bernardino, both in terms of the level of transit services that are being provided, as well as the overall sophistication of the systems. So as they move through the implementation guide, they're going to need to get into that level. Do you think that will address what you're talking about, Benji?
I don't know, but it's such a large region, right? And so if you're imagining that mass is peanut butter, it's never going to work, right? Unless you're imagining single payment systems where wherever you get, then that's workable, interoperable, right? So you can't write this as this is going to work everywhere at the same level. You're going to have to write on particular, schema or categories and how it applies, just as a reality of the differences in the region.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. The last question is, who should the MOS system serve? That has to some extent been addressed throughout our conversations, but let's focus in on that for a few minutes.
Well, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on who's funding it, quite honestly. If it's a public service, then obviously it should serve everyone, ideally. Of course, we know how well the record on that in other areas is, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't make the good effort. But I mean, in some regards, though, if it's all privately funded, I mean, like the scooters, for example, if they're privately funded and people are paying for them, I don't necessarily know if it is necessary that they serve everyone if they aren't undercutting the public service. I think is the big caveat there. And of course, as we were kind of goes back to the infrastructure thing too. If someone had started, I mean, we see this already with like Lyft and Uber and stuff. People will take an Uber for various distances out here in the Inland Empire because they can't wait for the bus, and so it's serving those people. Although not everyone can afford to do that, especially those who don't have access to like Lyft and Uber from finances or abilities or whatever. But is it Lyft or Uber's responsibility to improve the bus service or other transportation options, or is it the government's? And so it's what kind of comes down to, I think.
Well, and some of the examples that I think will come forward through the existing conditions report, and looking at how LA Metro right now is experimenting with different pilot projects, they're able through their TAP card to be able to target different constituencies and be able to provide discounted rates, for example, for seniors or for students, or for other demographic groups. So you're able to do that by having the single payment plan is to go in and be able to accomplish that. And in other areas of the country, they also have contracted with some of the private service providers like Uber and Lyft to provide service, for example, to meet a community need, where women, for example, who need to be able to accomplish different things early in the morning would have access at
So-
a reduced rate. Go
So
ahead.
I think
Philip.
we're gonna be dumped back into the main room now, I guess. Go ahead.
That's a quick
You
one.
might-
It's the wrong
right.
question. It's the wrong question. It's not who should mass serve.
Mhm.
It should be what should mass deliver.
Yeah, I
All
would agree.
right, I think
What should
that's a
master-
good point. All right, wonderful. Yeah, this was a great discussion and very insightful. Thank you for all your contributions.